Hello everybody. Well, it's spooky season and I thought I'd tell you some scary stories from Newcastle's past. So here we go with the first one. The Trunk. It's 1825 and the central station has not yet been built. Instead, we have a coaching house on Collingwood Street. Here is where the goods come and go through the town. And sometimes there was some strange cargo. In September of that year, a sealed trunk was causing concern. It was heading for Edinburgh, but the trunk was starting to leak. An almost unbearable odour was starting to emit from it. So the authorities were summoned and a magistrate gave permission to open it. The porters forced open the trunk, and as they looked inside, a terrible sight met their eyes. The decomposing body of a teenage girl. Now, there was little doubt what this was all about. The body had been stolen from a grave by a resurrectionist and was heading for the medical school in Edinburgh. Stealing bodies was a big business in the early 1800s. Body snatchers had near perfected taking bodies from fresh graves without their families even noticing. There was good money to be paid for bodies at medical schools. You could expect to get 10 guineas, or in today's money, £600 with no questions asked. And this would not be the last time bodies were found at Newcastle goods offices. When the body of a small child was discovered in a trunk, they found out that she had only been buried days before. The grave was inspected, and the signs of it being disturbed were so minimal that the family would never have known. There were even people who sold their bodies to resurrectionists before they died, readily taking the 10 guineas, hopefully well in advance. So next time you look at an old cemetery, such as in Jesmond, be aware that those huge railings, complex and formidable gravestones, sometimes with iron reinforcings, were there for a reason, to prevent the resurrectionists paying a visit. The toughest man in Newcastle. In 1754, Ewan MacDonald was drinking in a pub in the Big Market. Being a typical night there, he got into a fight with some pub regulars. He managed to fight off an impressive number of men, but, outnumbered and cornered, he produced a knife, which, unfortunately, he used to cut the throat of a police officer. The crowd cornered him, and he still managed to fight off several people, including breaking one of their arms. Eventually, he was detained and taken for trial, where he was told he would be hanged until dead on the Town Moor, and to add some extra spice to this punishment, he would then be taken to the medical school and dissected. And he was taken to the Town Moor, but before he could be hanged, he managed to throw the executioner off the scaffold. Still, he was eventually hanged, and then he was taken to his appointment at the medical school. He was set up for dissection that night, and left there. When doctors returned the following day, they were met with a troublesome sight. He was sitting upright on the table. He was heard to beg for mercy, but a quick-thinking surgeon approached him from behind with a hammer, and did what the executioner couldn't, and put an end to him once and for all. Interestingly, it's reported that the very surgeon who did this was killed by an out-of-control horse a few days later. The Town Moor explosion. On December 17th, 1867, something worrying was found in the cellar of the White Swan Inn in the town's cloth market. Almost a ton of nitroglycerine. Authorities suspect that this could be for a prison break and decided they need to dispose of it sharpish. The problem was how. Rail companies refused to transport it. Nitroglycerine is notoriously unstable and any wrong move could set it off. So, it was decided that the tins would be loaded onto a cart and carefully taken to the Town Moor. They planned to chuck them into the old mine workings for the Spittletongues colliery. John Mawson, the town sheriff, who had some amateur interest in explosives, decided that the tins should be emptied into a depression on the moor left by the colliery workings, and then the tins buried elsewhere. There was a problem though. The nitroglycerine had crystallised and was proving difficult to pour out. Perhaps a few shakes would get it loose. So at this point, there were 10 men there, some trying to empty the tins, and some just members of the public who had decided to tag along, perhaps hoping to see a controlled explosion. 2 of them did get to see an explosion. The rest were obliterated by it. Police Inspector Wallace, who survived, said most were killed instantly, but 2 did live for a few minutes afterwards. You can see the headstone of one of the killed men, Thomas Bryson, in Jesmond Old Cemetery to this day. The bizarre case of Autumn Summerhill. Autumn was born in 1930 and lived on Westgate Hill Terrace, just off Westgate Road, near the Discovery Museum. She worked as a secretary for an engineering firm. In an incredible story, she claims she woke up at 5 a.m. one morning in October 1961 to find her electricity was not working. Having no light, she ventured out to work earlier than usual in the dark. Walking down Westgate Road towards town, she said at first buildings looked normal until she reached the point where the Town Moor used to cross Westgate Road, where there was vastly more walls still standing than there should have been. Exploring more, she found a Newcastle she didn't recognise, and as the sun came up, she was able to discover, she claims, she was not in 1961, but in 1875. Her money was no good here, and in a panic she was hallucinating or having a vivid dream. She returned home, where she found the inside of her house was perfectly normal. Attempts to wake up from this nightmare failed, and she realised even to eat she needed money. Then, so she claims, she had an idea to sell her possessions. Surely something from 1961 would be worth a lot more money in 1875. She knew her clothes and furniture would be worth about the same, but then she realised she did have something incredible to sell: technology. At first she said she considered a battery radio, but it did nothing but receive static, and it needed new batteries anyway. Then she remembered something: her wind-up record player. So then, she claims, she headed for the Armstrong Engineering Building, where they would be interested in this technology. And they absolutely were blown away by the device, and she was able to sell it for the equivalent of £10,000 in today's money. But then she claims something strange began to happen. She would glitch between 1875 and 1961, and each time she did, the money vanished from her possession. So, she claims, she converted the money to gold coins, which she buried in the small garden of her house. 2 days later, she woke up in her house to discover it was 1961 again, and all seemed back to normal. 4 days after this, she dug up the gold in her garden. And that is the story of how she explained how she came into possession of the equivalent of £90,000 of gold coins in 1961. And yet, in a strange coincidence, approximately the same amount of gold was discovered to have been stolen from a museum in Durham 6 years earlier. Miss Muffet's strange request. On the 14th of June 1800, a beggar named Wilkinson had fallen on hard times, but his lucky day had arrived, because he was taken in by Miss Muffet, who brought him food and drink and looked after him for the day. Miss Muffet lived on Pilgrim Street, where she looked after horses. Wilkinson must have thought that he had finally found a break from his bad luck. But it was at the end of the night when she had a strange request of him. She put a hatchet on the table on which he was eating. Then, when he finished his meal, she placed both hands on the table and asked him to hack her fingers off. She explained that she'd had trouble with them for some time, and they had to go. Wilkinson was taken aback by the request, assuming he was about to be bamboozled in some sort of scam. But she continued asking, even begging him to chop them off. Picking up the hatchet and waiting for some sort of trick to be revealed, he found none. Miss Muffet pointed out how she had fed and given him shelter, and he needed to return the favour. After much confusion, Wilkinson lifted the hatchet as if to strike, but Miss Muffet kept her hands firmly on the table. After some confusion and debate, he eventually swung the hatchet down, cutting off 3 fingers from her hand. But Miss Muffet kept the other hand on the table and told him to strike again. This time he hacked off 2 fingers from her other hand. Then, Miss Muffet was sent to the infirmary, and Wilkinson to jail. It was explained that Miss Muffet occasionally was subject to fits of insanity, and he had sadly been the victim of one. Well, I hope you liked those stories, and perhaps, just perhaps, I made one of them up. Stay spooky, and I'll see you in the next video.